You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Hello and welcome to TFM's Books and Comics show for Star Trek. And I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and here with me, as he is every single time these days, the wonderful, the illustrious Chris Jones.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for that. It's been too long a sacrifice here on the network, talking about books and comics over the years, but we're still going strong.
It's very true. It's very true. I see you're making too long a sacrifice by wearing your Alabama sweatshirt, since, they won the national championship or something this year, or whatever.
Yeah, it's just something we do from time to time.
Yeah. Pretty frequently these days. But anyway, you're not here to talk about sports ball. You're here to listen to us talk about Star Trek books and comics, and we're so excited to do that this week as we gave it away. We're going to be talking about the full comic run, Too Long a Sacrifice, the Deep Space Nine comic that had just come out and finished up there at the end of 2020, and so we're finally going to talk about the whole thing together. But before we get there, just a quick reminder, you can find the show wherever you get your podcasts, and so please do find us and subscribe to us wherever that is. If you're on Apple Podcasts, we'd love a star rating review. That definitely continues to help the show grow. And then, of course, you can find us on Twitter at TrekFM or on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. There's the Babel Conference that you can join just by typing Babel into the search field on Facebook. There's some questions. We can let you in. You can talk to listeners from all over the world. We've got the website, Trek.fm, where you can also go to the contact section and you can send us an email if you'd like. And, of course, we're also even on Instagram at TrekFM. So all of those places that you can find us, and we hope that you will.
And one more thing, Matthew, starting up, I'm doing one tomorrow at noon, and we're going to be scheduling one every other week, so 2 a month now. We've got the Patrons at Roundtables going again, where you can hop on with me and other listeners and talk about Star Trek. We'll pick random topics, so I hope people will choose to join in that as well.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, so you'll just want to make sure to join into that. You'd have to support us through Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM. And Chris and I will talk a little bit more about that later, but it's definitely a good plug for why you'd want to join supporting the network. So, Chris, we only have a couple of news items because there's not a ton going on right now. And in fact, actually, Upcoming Comics is really what we have to talk about because we don't have any upcoming books until a couple months down the road here. And so luckily, though, in February, we're going to be getting Year 5, number 20, as well as the roundup and the wrap-up for Seven's Reckoning with Issue 4. So I'm very interested. Obviously, both of these comics, I think, have led us into some interesting areas, especially Year 5 with everything that's going on with Gary 7 and ISIS. The cat, that is, not, the terrorist organization. Completely different. And so I'm really excited to see where that goes. And then, of course, I'm hoping that Seven's Reckoning can kind of bring that story full circle and wrap up maybe in a surprising and maybe better way than I feel like it's going at this exact moment.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're both looking forward to the Gary 7 situation and to find out exactly why ISIS is doing what we saw her do in the last comic. And then Seven's Reckoning, I think that's going to be the payoff because, one reason I'm glad that today we're talking about Too Long a Sacrifice after we have the entire story is that we can really discuss how it all fits together, what the message is behind it, and what we think about the overall story. Whereas Seven's Reckoning, we've been doing that bit by bit, and each time I feel a little bit like I'm not sure how much I have to say about this installment, But once it's all done, I think it might turn out to be a pretty good story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even just referencing what we're going to talk about this week, I think that I probably would have felt a little bit like that in issue 3 of this too, because there's some good exposition in it. There's some interesting things, but really it's the thing that's like giving you just enough to where you just are then ready for the end. So absolutely, I agree with you there. So it's exciting that we'll be getting both of those in February. Also, we are excited because, we want to make sure that we continue to bring you great episodes here. And it obviously, for Chris and I to get together with our time differences and everything can be difficult. And so we wanted to continue to bring you the continuation of the 21st Century novels that Dan and Bruce had started. And they kind of left off, and we're going to be welcoming Bruce back here over the next few months for a while, and maybe beyond. We'll see how everything goes, but we are going to be continuing the 24th Century novels with him together, and so he'll be joining me for that, which will be a lot of fun, which means you're going to get more episodes of Literary Treks, which is the most important thing, but we'll be picking up with Titan Synthesis, which I'm very excited to do, obviously, since we had just talked to James about his latest Picard novel, so I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and honestly, for the listeners, it's the best of news. It's definitely the best of times because, well, you'll be getting more Literary Treks.
Yeah, it's going to be great to have Bruce back. So thank you, Bruce, for agreeing to do that. And I hope everyone enjoys that continuation of the 24th century.
Yeah, me too. I would say for me, it is mostly I would say it's probably my favorite era of Trek books, and there was so much great stuff there. So absolutely excited to be able to continue that. So that's what we have, to look forward to here coming up on Literary Treks. It's going to be great. But Chris, I think it's time maybe for us to dive into the feature and talk about that super long sacrifice.
Yeah, let's do that.
So, Chris, one of the things, the way we're kind of going to structure this episode is we're going to talk about, each issue and what's going on in each issue and kind of build. But before we even got there, with comics, this is such a big deal, art. And so I thought we should have a discussion about the art because immediately when you open up this comic, it definitely has an artistic style, which I would say is minimalist. There's not a lot that is happening stroke-wise. There's not a lot of markings on the page when it comes to the art. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of definition. It's I would say it's very impressionistic of the characters. And so I wondered for you, I wanted to talk to you about that before we even got into the issues. What did you end up thinking about the art here in Too Long a Sacrifice?
Yeah, that immediately caught my eye as well. And I honestly, at first, I didn't like it very much because I prefer to have a lot more detail. I prefer for the characters to look more like they do on the screen. And in here, often that's not the case. In here, often they don't look much like the characters at all. At other times, they do look like the characters, but in a very simplified way. And then there are times where you get quite a bit of detail if you've got a really close-up shot. It's rather inconsistent. But what I got to thinking about, and I wanted to ask you what you think about this, is I do feel, of course, on the artist's part, this is very much an intentional decision. It's not that the artist can't draw the characters in great detail. They've chosen to draw them this way for the purpose of this story, knowing that it's sort of like, it's like a noir, it's a detective story, it's a murder mystery. We're kind of seeing, we're being delivered the story sort of through Odo's eyes. It's kind of like a recounting is the way I look at it of these events that happen. I mean, do you feel that perhaps this style is being used to focus your attention more on the story itself and less on the visuals, and then leading you through? And does does it help the murder mystery aspect of the story come to the surface?
That is a good question. And I wondered, why they had chosen this style as I was, beginning the comic. And, I think you just rightly pinpointed that, there are so moments where it does work. Like the characters look right, or they capture a moment really well. I wondered if the point of using this artistic style was the kind of malaise that we're in the comic. We have it's war. There's all of these murders happening on the station. There's a bombing on the station. And so that in some ways the art feeling and not derogatorily. I don't mean it to sound like this, but when I say the word muddied, like everything just isn't clear. And I kind of wondered if that was the reason for the artistic choice of to do the art that way. And it could be. And I would say, as with you, this is not my favorite art style. I don't mind going minimalistic with the art, but I do appreciate if the minimalism can still make the characters look more like themselves as they do on screen. And again, there are moments where they really do, and then there are other moments where it just feels almost like I'm looking through a glass darkly,
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at, what is this? This is page 15. There's a scene with Sisko and Kira and Jadzia and Odo in Sisko's ready room. And the only character that even remotely looks like themselves is Sisko. And Kira, I mean, it looks like maybe Kira's stunt double's cousin is in the scene. It doesn't look like her at all. But on the same page, then if you drop down to the bottom half of the page, there's a shot of her that does look pretty much like Kira. So I don't know. It's an interesting approach to the art, and I'm sure that there's a good thought process behind the choice. But for me, it's definitely not my favorite style, no.
Yeah. And I mean, in the end, whether or not the art style is necessarily my favorite in a comic, I do think it really does come down to then, if that's not working for me completely, it's going to come down to the story. And I would say, as we dive in to issue 1, I was interested to see, where the comic would take place in the timeline, and we are kind of smack in the middle of the Dominion War. And so I appreciated that was the story point, because it's one of the most interesting parts of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And then I kind of wondered, I wonder how this is going to kind of work itself into the show. How will this actually work? Because, that's... It could be hard, especially since you got so serialized there, to really make this fit, and I think they really do. So that's where for me, the art and the story did kind of somewhat combine. Where I was like, okay, we're in the middle of the war. This makes a little bit more sense that things do feel like this. And so I liked that we're in that point, and we start off the comic by having Garrick and Bashir meeting up for lunch at a restaurant there on the Promenade. And, well, things do legitimately start off with a bang, because there's an explosion in this restaurant, killing 8 people and almost killing Garrick and Bashir.
Yeah, and that actually, I didn't know where the story was going at first. And when Garrick invites, when they go to lunch together, I thought that, that is exactly what I would expect from Garrick and Bashir. And I thought that the introduction of the Bajoran woman, Levine, was well done. Like, you don't suspect anything's going on at that point, right? To be clear, you don't even know if she's the owner of the restaurant, if she's a waitress, or what's going on. But everything seemed quite normal. And then that explosion, it really caught me off guard. And I thought it really set the story into motion very well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, as the explosion happens, again, Bashir and Garrick are able, to survive. And we find out as Odo is questioning the owner, who is this Bajoran named Levin. She believes that this is Quark. And she believes that it's Quark who, he's always wanted her out of business because she's, her and her restaurant are a rival for him and his bar. And she blames him. And so I thought that was, it's an interesting start to the story. It was like, oh, wow, already blaming Quark. Man, not a good day for Quark.
But what did you think about that, though? Because obviously, as a viewer, you don't think Quark's going to bomb someone's restaurant. In general, Quark's not going to bomb someone, and certainly not just to get rid of another restaurant on the Promenade. So what did you think about her accusation, and what did that make you think in terms of where the story is headed?
Yeah, I did discount it, but I think one of the things that this comic does is it does keep you guessing throughout the series. And as you go from issue to issue, and they do actually bring up reasons for you to believe that it possibly could be Quark as we move through the series, which I think that's really interesting to me, and I think that's really smart for them to not just immediately discount it. Right. And of course it's Odo. So, although this doesn't seem like something that Quark would do, he can't discount anything here, especially at the beginning of an investigation. And in the investigation, we also find out too, which is, this is horrendous, but that there are these specific darts that have been used inside the bomb to create shrapnel that will basically kill and create the maximum amount of damage and the maximum amount of death as possible. And so in many ways, and Cisco even says this in one of the meetings he has is, look, we're at war. This is a very big problem, and this could be a political powder keg if we don't keep this under control, because obviously it involves the station, it involves the Ferengi, it involves Bajorans, and there are Nausicaans who died in there. There are all of these different people who died inside the restaurant, and this could be the worst timing for something like this to happen if we can't figure this out more quickly than not.
Did you ever think that the attack might have come from the outside, and it might have been the Dominion, for example, trying to separate these powers, like create conflict within the powers? I
did have that in my mind, and there were a couple moments throughout the issues, honestly, where they maybe allude to the fact, and then there are a couple of places then where they actually, where I thought, oh, maybe it's going to go that way, and then they kind of immediately shut that down. So I would say, even though I thought that might be something they could do, I'm actually really impressed that that's not what they did, because that, I think, would have been slightly too easy, because, and we've seen that happen before, Deep Space Nine. So this goes a way in which we've seen some of this story before, but the way they set it up and the way they structured it, you're kind of expecting one thing, and it turns out to be something completely different. And I liked the surprise of what they do. I think the fact that they don't go that way was really smart on their point, because I think we would have been like, oh, this feels too familiar.
Yeah. For me, I never really thought that it might be an external force, like the Dominion involved in the war. I think when I think about DS9 and things like this that happened on the station, I tend to come back to the Bajoran situation and the occupation and like old grudges or old conflicts that happened on Terok Nur or that happened on Bajor during the occupation, and the station being the setting for some kind of retaliation, just based on stories that we've had in this series. I tend to think that way at first. Now, I did not see the twist coming at the end. I thought they did a nice job of concealing that. I was probably more suspicious of Garrick's potential involvement than I was Quark's or an external Dominion force of some kind.
Well, and I mean, and then kind of as this issue does wrap up, what we see here is that there are, these Nausicaans have died, and these Nausicaans come in, and they're actually apparently the brothers of the people who died, and they're suspicious, they say, of Quark. And so we've added a lot of different layers of people who could possibly be involved, or you might think that are involved. And then, we end the issue with the fact that the darts that were found in the shrapnel used in the bomb are actually also in cargo shipments that are Quarks. And so this leads us to point, as we end issue 1 and get into issue 2, that there's a possibility that this really could be Quark.
Or that he's involved in helping in some way.
Exactly, that he's involved somehow.
Yeah. Although knowing Quark, he could be unwittingly importing the materials that someone else is using.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would say, for myself personally, that is what I've, my brain went to that is the most logical, is that Quark, this happened to Quark, and somebody's done it to him, and it's not something he's done for himself, like that he's been trying to do.
Right. Or maybe not even that someone has done this to him, but simply someone has gotten him to import these, and he has no idea why, right. And he might not even realize what they are. You never know what could have been put on a manifest, for example, because he's always importing all kinds of stuff to the station.
Well, and they do make the point, too, that these are things that are actually illegal in the Federation. So right. This is, I mean, Quark would have to be doing something that is very underhanded, even for him. But we leave the first issue with this question. In the second issue, we start off immediately, and we find out that Quark had dealings, and I put that in quotations, dealings, underhanded dealings with these Nausicaans, and they might have felt, gypped by him, and so that we realize that they could have hard feelings against Quark, so it helps with the motivation for somebody to possibly be setting Quark up in this. So I love the way, again, we just kind of keep adding layers to what's happening here.
Although I will say one twist here, one thing that made me a little bit uncertain is that on the first page of the second issue, in thinking whether Quark may be involved or not, I was a little bit confused because I wasn't sure who this Ferengi is who's being interrogated by Worf and Odo, because it doesn't look anything like Quark. So I don't know who that character might be. I'm just kidding. Little jab there at the art style. But let me ask you a question. Now, this is something I was trying to figure out. Where does this story fall on the timeline? Because when Worf first came to the station, there was, of course, some friction between him and Odo in terms of security, because Worf had been in charge of security on the Enterprise. Now he's on a space station where there's a lot more stuff going on that would make you uneasy as a security officer, and yet you're no longer in a position to be involved in providing security, and you don't like the approach of the person who is. So there was some friction, but that started to fade away, as the series went on. But we get that here. And it caught me a bit off guard, and I was wondering, why are we getting that at this point in the story? So if we look at the star date in the first investigator's notes that Odo took going back to the first issue, the star date is established. It's 51636.5. Now, in terms of where that falls on the timeline, that would be kind of like late season 6.
Interesting.
On the TV show. It would be, it's between like One Little Ship, Honor Among Thieves, and it's before In the Pale Moonlight, which is, of course, the big twist with getting the Romulans involved in the war. So I feel like at that point, Worf is already doing his own thing, and this little twist to the story, or not twist, this little aspect of the story, that felt a little bit out of place to me.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. I didn't expect to see this because obviously we don't see Worf being like this after season 4. So I didn't get necessarily why we were having Worf have such a problem with Odo at this point in his style.
Yeah. Unless it's the classic TNG movie thing where we need Worf to show up and do something. So why don't we have him help with the investigation?
Well, what's interesting is that, like you said, kind of quickly that fades and then they start working together and then they kind of play good cop, bad cop in a minute, which is really interesting because one of the big things that happens here in issue 2 is that somebody else ends up dead, and it is the Bajoran health minister who's found dead in a part of the station that does not have any cameras or anything for people to be able to see. And his last known place to visit before he shows up dead was Garrick's shop. And so, this is where, like you said earlier, Garrick kind of comes into speculation as maybe somebody who would be a part of this, even though, he was at the restaurant that was attacked and he could have been killed himself. So we are throwing light on so many different people who could maybe be involved or possibly involved or had something to do with it or, be the culprit in the first place. And this just adds one more place for that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, right after that, this is where Worf has an idea to basically do some aggressive detecting, which I thought was great.
It's a great name for a band also.
It's
detecting.
related to aggressive negotiations.
That's going to be your new show. Yeah.
Yeah, aggressive detecting.
Yeah.
A mystery podcast.
Yes. For those who don't know, Matthew has a Star Wars podcast with John Mills called Aggressive Negotiations.
So what did you think of that, though? Because, they basically break up an illegal card game and play good cop, bad cop, and find out that, this leads to the Nausicaans actually being the ones who had, brought on this material, not Quark. So, that's... it works. Worf had a great idea here. He didn't get told no.
Well, oh, right. Hey, that's true. Wow. Worf did not get told no. I just realized that. Very good point. I will say that it fits well with Deep Space Nine. It's probably the only Star Trek series where you could walk in and break up an illegal card game as part of a story plot. I thought them working together was good. And of course, later on, we get another investigator. So we get kind of like 3 approaches in this story to trying to uncover what's going on in a murder case. The card game itself was interesting that, if I'm not mistaken, one of the aliens here is supposed to be a Betelgeusian, I believe.
Probably.
Which is, a character that we saw in the motion picture, and then we didn't see again for a long time, but which resurfaced in season 3 of Star Trek Discovery. And now you see these aliens popping up Discovery's bringing back a lot of old aliens, and now they're starting to appear in comics and places where we didn't see them before.
Well, it was great, too, because in the scene we have the conference scene with Starfleet officers. We see an Andorian, we see a Tellarite arguing about Vulcans, which was really fun.
Yeah.
So it felt like it. And before we saw Andorians in Enterprise, the beauty of Deep Space Nine is I think they were the show who maybe mentioned Andorians the most, but we never actually saw them. So
yeah, right. Yeah. Well, and we've even got a bird on the very first page of the entire comic in the background.
It's true.
So
yeah,
that's true. The Garrick thing also I found interesting because when he's talking to Odo and Worf, he reminds them that this station has more tales to tell than even and even longer memory, which of course is a statement that does turn out to be key to the entire story. And that worked for me with Garrick because he obviously knows things that happen on the station and individuals and dynamics between people that maybe Odo knows some, but not as much as Garrick, and Worf would have no idea about. Yeah. And there's another point, I forget where it is in the story, but they're talking about, well, Garrick was at the restaurant. He could have been killed, so it can't possibly have been him. And Odo said, well, he did blow up his own shop one time. So you never know with Garrick what he might do.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And, one of the things that we see here is that, and we have a visit here with some Vedics, and we find out that the minister who died, Kidan, was a well-connected Bajoran and a collaborator to which the provisional government had allowed to stay basically alive and in business because they needed his trade networks. And so they allowed him to basically stay in business because of that. And we also find out that a Ferengi trade delegation is here on the station to help the Federation with the problem that they're having right now. And like you mentioned, this is before the Romulans come into the war, and they're having a problem with munitions. They need 500, the Vulcans say they need 500 quantum torpedoes for this upcoming battle, and it turns out that they don't even have 50. So we see
Matthew,
here,
I think 300 would be plenty, but that's just me.
Yeah. But I think, to me, that makes this really fascinating because we're really deepening the story here, and we're spending a lot of time with what's going on here in a way that is really it's so Deep Space Nine to kind of layer in all of these things that are happening all at one time. And that, obviously the beauty of Deep Space Nine is that we were worried about more than just one ship. Like, this is the entire galaxy that we're worried about. And, therefore, all of these elements converging and happening at the same time makes so much sense for this really busy, bustling station that's a trade commerce, a place where the war is at the head, and so I really appreciate that about this. And this doesn't help anything because, now we put the Federation in a really terrible predicament because they have problems with the Ferengis now. They have problems with the Nausicaans. They have problems with, because there was a Benzonite that had died. They have problems with the Bajorans because it blew up, one of their citizens' businesses was blown up. So, it couldn't be going any worse. This is Cisco's awful, rotten, not very good, terrible, no good day.
Right. Actually, so that's a really interesting point that you made about the quantum torpedoes and not being able to procure those. And what I said earlier about where this falls on the timeline in terms of the star date, we are just right before In the Pale Moonlight. So if we want to think about, this is a story, this is something that happened on the station during the series, but we didn't get to see it. Like, this episode didn't happen for us because they had to do Time's Orphan. They had to get that ready at the end of season 6, and so they didn't have time to make this one, so we didn't get to see it.
Yeah, that was a really important one, Glad you got that one in, guys.
Right. But this happened, and it happened just before In the Pale Moonlight. So if you look at the situation that the Federation has been put in, where they really need help from somewhere, so that might really push Sisko to make that decision that he's going to try to get the Romulans to come into the war. And then also you look at Garrick's involvement in this story, and then Garrick's involvement in helping Sisko bring the Romulans into the war. It really does fit nicely within that narrative as events that had a strong influence on what we did see, only they're events that we didn't know about until now.
Yes. Well, and yeah, it's really interesting because they're going to bring in a new security officer, but this security officer is not a part of Starfleet. This is going to be a civilian Federation security officer that also happens to be a Betazoid. So that should be a very interesting challenge. And of course, this is another place where Odo is not necessarily being put aside, but as all the issues that we just mentioned that are going on, all of the different connections, all of the different races that are all kind of combining here to be angry basically at the Federation because of what's happening on the station, they're bringing in somebody else to help them with the investigation to hopefully get this wrapped up as quickly as possible. And so that's where we leave issue 2 and get into issue 3.
Now, it's interesting with this security officer that he turns out to be a Betazoid. And again, it's a case of fitting this story into what's happening with the Dominion War, because we do have that mention that comes up that Beta Z has been occupied by the Dominion. But it's not really a plot point of the war that we explore on the series. And yet the impact of that occupation on the Betazoid people it's key to the outcome of this story, I guess is how I would put it.
Yeah, and I mean it's weighing heavily on what Retlaw is thinking about. He's this idea of there being an occupation on Beta Z, and luckily his wife and his daughter are safe, but he knows that there are so many that are not. So that does create a nice connection with the story. And of course, we have the book that has been covered here on Literary Trek's Battle of Beta Z, which is tells that story for us. And so, and in 2, we see here that it makes him uncomfortable that he can't read Odo, and he also, he has kind of a preconception about who Odo is based on what he knows of the Founders. And even though he's not necessarily blaming Odo, and he even says that, I'm not blaming you, I'm not taking this out on you, but it does make him uneasy. And he admits that to Odo, and I think that creates a really nice kind of a character arc we get here in the storyline as we move forward. But really, I mean, this issue is a very interesting issue because I would say there's a lot of exposition that happens, but not necessarily all super important to the storyline. But I wanted to ask you this. One thing we do find out is that, obviously the Federation has very strict rules about how investigations can be conducted, especially when it comes to investigators who are telepaths. And it was interesting to find out that the Federation can authorize the use of telepathy if they deem it necessary enough for the security of, the Federation. And that's exactly what's happened here. Retlaw has been given that permission to use all of his powers to bring to justice whoever's responsible for this. That was really fascinating to me and also made quite a bit of sense. So
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it did stand out to me when Odo, brought up the point that these types of techniques, what is the legality of it? Is it appropriate in an investigation to do this? And then we find out, well, here's an exception that could be made. It's a little bit of commentary that I feel like gets it from the start of the third issue on to the end. I feel like we get a fair bit of social commentary, talking about the world today and maybe over the past decade or two. This particular bit, I can see it playing in a bit into questions of, what kind of techniques can be used to get information from people if you deem it important enough on a national security level, or in this case, a Federation security level. And then there's also the question of, if you think about using telepathy, being able to have access to the internal, intimate thoughts of a person without their permission, but also without compelling them to give you that information. It's sort of akin to the debate these days over smartphones, for example, especially now that we have biometrics where you could just put your finger or you could just look at the phone, right? And it would unlock. Can an investigator gain access to your thoughts, which are stored not in your head necessarily, but in a device, by just forcing you? It's not, I guess forcing is the right word, but I just think of like simply putting your finger on something or simply looking at a face sensor would give them very easy access in the way that an empath or a telepath would be able to just read those thoughts from your mind. So I think it's kind of an interesting, it's only barely touched on here. It's not the way you would do it in a science fiction novel that was focused on the subject, but it's that scratching the surface of that kind of commentary and debate, which is appropriate in this story because you're dealing with Odo as an investigator. Yeah. And we all know that Odo himself, he's a by-the-book person, but he also, I think, is willing to use techniques that maybe the Federation normally wouldn't be willing to use.
No, I definitely agree with you. And what makes this interesting here is that as they're having their conversation together, two more Ferengis have shown up dead. And so, honestly, things just keep getting worse for them.
Mm-hmm. And that's felt like a little bit of a TOS twist there because they were killed by someone blowing darts at them. Mm-hmm. Feels like something that would happen in an original series episode. Some red shirts beam down to the planet, darts fly out from behind rocks, and they're gone.
Well, what's great about this, though, is that, the security officer, he asks Odo, are there any cameras where we could see this? And, of course, there aren't because this is a Cardassian station, and there were not a lot of cameras installed in different areas.
Right.
And so this is where they come to the idea that there's a good possibility then that this is an inside job, that somebody inside is helping whoever's doing this, that would allow them to, not be caught, to be able to know where these things are possibilities. So that's a fascinating thing that they kind of come to as an idea.
Yeah. So obviously we're going to get to the inside job part in a moment because it's key to the rest of the story. I did want to ask you, though, this idea that there aren't many cameras around for security because it's a Cardassian station, that struck me as pretty odd because they've already refitted this Cardassian station with this weapons system that obviously the station wasn't built with so they can defend the station. They've refitted so many aspects of the station. Would it be so hard to put some security cameras in the hallways? And don't you think Odo would want to do that?
I mean, it is a good question, although you have to remember, too, and maybe this would be something you could get into, it's a Bajoran station, and maybe Bajorans don't like CCTV cameras everywhere.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe. That's possible.
So, I mean, that's the only thing I can think of that, would...
It just felt like very convenient for the plot.
Sure.
That there would, that in the 24th century during a time of war, that there wouldn't be any cameras. Whereas, I don't know what it's like in the United States these days in large cities, but, here in Tokyo, we have cameras around. If you go to a city like London, there are cameras all over the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
In public. And it just seemed kind of odd to me that the station wouldn't have that. And I could easily see a different story where you needed to have cameras, and we would find out that there are cameras lining the corridors.
Now, see, it doesn't really, I mean, it does make sense to me in the way that this station was built. I mean, it's really, I mean, it was meant to be an ore processing station.
Yeah, in that case,
it wasn't
sure.
meant to be a place where people lived other than Cardassians really being in those areas, and I don't think they thought that there would be, so
Right.
that makes sense in that sense.
That does, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think, the question of why was that never added later, and maybe that has something to do with Cardassian construction as well, and we know they use deuterium, and that may be not the easiest thing to just install these type of systems everywhere, even though we'll find out later that somebody has installed. But anyway, it is a good question. So
I'm picturing a show on Space HGTV, like DIY security cameras, and they're trying to do it, and they're like, the first thing you've got to do is find your way past the deuterium walls.
It's like Space Fixer-Upper.
Yeah.
Welcome to
Before and
Deep
after
Space Nine
shots.
Fixer-Upper. Oh, man. Well, I think it's interesting because we get Retlaw wanting to question the different suspects and people involved, and we go through some of that. And really where this leads us to is somebody that he needs to talk to, which is the Nausicaan that Odo has in custody. And Odo obviously didn't get much out of him, but Retlaw is able to. And doing that, they find out that there's an Ensign Coleman Schroeder who they need to talk to. And so they arrange a meeting with this Ensign Schroeder, and it is very interesting because in this meeting, Retlaw is having a very hard time reading him at all.
Now, of course, there's going to be some ensign who's the inside man. That seems to happen from time to time in Star Trek stories. So that revelation didn't surprise me very much. And in fact, I probably should have thought about it earlier on. The bit here about him being able to block Retlaw from reading his mind, they never come back to that, do they? They never explain how he's doing that. And that's something I was a bit disappointed in. I wanted some explanation of what was going on. Was it some kind of, was he injected with something that creates some kind of block? Or is there something else going on? Does he have a device on him that's somehow blocking him?
Right.
Are the Ferengi involved? Because did the Ferengi find a way that what prevents Betazoids from reading the thoughts of Ferengi, which, if I remember, has to do with the lobe structure of their head, I believe, right? Did they find some way to kind of emulate that to give that protection to someone else? I think it'd be interesting to know what that is, but we never come back to it.
Yeah, I think what's also really interesting here, and like you said, they never come back to it, but this is one of the places where you could have jumped to the conclusion that, this is a changeling, and they make it very specific that he can sense him being there, his presence, but he can't sense his thoughts the way he should be able to. So they differentiate between his feelings and not being able to sense Odo at all. Odo basically being
Right.
Odo basically is like a blank spot to him. There's nothing there.
Right.
Whereas this person, it's there, but he just can't get deeper inside the way he would be able to with normal people.
Yeah. So they've discounted the possibility that he is a changeling right there.
Yes. Yeah. Which was
so
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So that possibility is gone at that point.
And I do think it's interesting, though, that, they go back to Garrick's shop to ask him if he had seen Ensign Schroeder at all or overheard anything, because, Garrick is very good at that. And this is where Garrick has himself in his shop installed some security cameras, and
because the walls around his shop are not made of deuterium.
Apparently, yes. So he did a little bit of Garrick fixer-upper himself, and so he has a video where this Ensign Schroeder is actually having a meeting with the Vedic. And that leads us to believe, of course, that the Vedic had something to do with this. And as, they're talking about it with Sisko, Kira's very much opposed to them questioning him and treating him like a criminal. And so Sisko just encourages them to do it discreetly. And this is a moment where we have two darts as Odo and as Odo and Retlaw are walking on the abandoned, it's very late at night at this point on the station, they are almost assassinated, which is, they realize, okay, well, this means we must be getting close.
But of course, they assume that it's connected to the Vedic, that like somehow they're approaching his quarters and therefore they're being attacked.
Yes.
It's also interesting that, well, first of all, the Vedic should know by now, if he's been around for so long, don't have meetings in Garrick's shop.
No.
Wouldn't you know that? I mean, that's a really bad idea. And the thing about Kira, this is another thing that, I mean, it's a great parallel to how the real world works, right? That she has this blind spot when it comes to the Bajoran religion and governmental structure and like the culture that she, and maybe I'm reading more into this. Do you feel her only concern is upsetting the Bajoran government and how that might affect the status of the station? Or do you feel that it is that she can't believe that a Vedic could be involved in this, and somehow you shouldn't bother a Vedic with these types of things? Because I think in the real world, that is often an obstacle to finding out the truth, that someone in a certain position, and it doesn't have to be a religious thing, but it's just someone in a certain position you feel shouldn't be disturbed and should be untouchable, and therefore you don't go down paths that are necessary in order to find the truth or resolve a situation.
I didn't quite feel it that way. I felt like she trusted this Vedic, and therefore that's the reason she thought highly of him. I think Kira has too much experience with people in power in the Bajoran religion who are not like this. Obviously Kai Wynn, numero uno in that discussion. So I do think this doesn't have anything to necessarily do with that. But I think it is an interesting point, the idea about, having blind spots. And we confront this Vedic, and that's where this issue ends and the last issue begins. And
well, what was interesting right there, though, is that at this point in the story, I'm really feeling like this Vedic very likely has something to do with it.
Yes.
Because we've seen that kind of story, right? And that's why I felt like Kira's blind spot might stall the investigation at a critical moment. But then the abrupt nature in which we find out that this is a dead end, that was also a little bit surprising. You go in, you think that they're going to get some information, and then suddenly it's like, no, it wasn't him.
Yeah.
Just like slam the door on it, right?
Yeah. I thought that this was really well done in that sense, though, because he reads his mind and it's not him. And so, but what we find out, and this is one of the places, again, the art does this in a couple places, but this Vedic kind of goes a little bit crazy in the art, where he's talking about living under the thumb of the Cardassians, and he just looks insane, and it just feels like it's over the top for what's going on. But what we find is that this Vedic was also involved in much the same way that the health minister was as being a collaborator. And so, we're finding, like you said, the station here has a long memory, and wars like that and occupations like that have long consequences. And it was a good continuation of the thematic elements here, and I thought it was interesting too, because something that he says, which is, he said, "You were here." It makes Odo think, and he goes back to the restaurant, and this is where we get everything unraveled, and we find out who the killer is. And honestly, I don't know about you, but I didn't really see this one coming.
No, this was a surprise. The reason behind her doing it made sense, but I didn't see that twist coming. Maybe when we finally got back to the restaurant, at that point I started thinking a little bit like, oh, maybe, but it wasn't like, I think this is the killer.
Yeah. Well, and what we find out is that Laban's brother was the casualty of Kidan and the Vedic making deals with the Cardassians. And he ends up killed because of that. And so she seduced the ensign to help her because she needed somebody inside to help her pull this off. And this is where we kind of see that idea of too long a sacrifice. Even if she had to sacrifice her entire restaurant, even if she had to sacrifice her life, she was going to kill this person who was responsible for the death of her brother. And I just thought that this was so interesting, because to me, it really came off of this idea of when we completely become consumed by the past and we cannot find a way to let things go. That we cannot find a way, that we get lost in the idea of revenge, and obviously, as we know, revenge is a dish best served cold, and it doesn't taste good. Like, she doesn't actually, by the end of this, she spent so many years looking for revenge that once she gets it, she's completely broken mentally. Like, she's just wasted. She has nothing left, because she spent so many years looking towards this. And I really appreciated this idea and seeing this idea of that if you spend so much time consumed with what happened in the past and you can never find a way to make your peace with it somehow, that it will eat you alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to that, being obsessed with something that happened in the past, not being able to let it go, letting it take over your thoughts, how you approach things. It also is true of not necessarily events or wrongs that happen to you, but ideas that you can't let go of. Like, you get caught up in something. That's what I see as also appropriate. When I said earlier, there are some bits of social commentary that get into the story towards the end. I mean, that's one that you just described. And related to that, when we look at a lot of discourse today, people, and sometimes it's based on past events, but it could be very recent history, and it could be in the here and now, people latch on to a hatred or they dismiss a group, or they want to get revenge, or they want to shut out a group in some way, and it just completely controls everything they do, and like all reason goes out the window, and it spirals out of control. And that's what we see just in social discourse today, with two extreme sides pushing back on each other. And that also came to mind for me as I was reading the end of the story, in addition to the obvious situation of how she was personally affected by a horrific act of her brother being killed.
Mm-hmm. No, I heartily agree. And I think the other thing that was really interesting here was seeing how, we have this connection with Odo and Retlaw and how, his preconceptions about who Odo would be is based off of his preconceptions about what the founders are as people, and that they're all monolith. And I think the beauty of that was that this really shows that we have to be open-minded to people regardless of where they come from, and that we should let their actions determine how we judge them, because that's the only way to make any determination about a person. So we can't make a determination about a person by their skin color or where they're from or who their parents were or any of these type of things. We must make a determination by the conduct of people's character, and their actions, because that's the only true testament of who a person is. And that's what he learns here. And him and Odo are able to part as friends because of it. They part as colleagues, and people who respect one another. I really appreciated that, because I could not think of a more timely, important theme to be portrayed here. And this, I think, is where, when it comes down to the comic here, Chris, I believe this encapsulates beautifully the type of storytelling that we got on Deep Space Nine over and over and over again. And so I'm really wondering, what would you rate this, do you think?
Well, before I get to my rating of it, just the thing that you said there, and Retlaw's acceptance of Odo in particular, because he had prejudged him, that ties into what I was just saying. And it's one of the things that made me really think about it, is that, especially in social media these days, people, they just judge everybody on the absolute most superficial factors. And they don't know the people. And sometimes they kind of know the person, but they still judge them anyway on extremely superficial factors. And it's a huge problem in society, and if we want to improve. And I like the way that this comic ends, where, this is a man whose planet has been occupied by the people to whom Odo belongs as a race, the founders, and yet they're able to overcome that and see good in each other and respect each other. So I think that's a really important point. As far as my rating, story-wise, I actually gave this story 5 deuterium columns out of 5, wall supports. Overall for the comic, I rated it 4. And the reason is just because the art style, to me, it doesn't work for me very well for the most part. But the story I thought was excellent and felt like it would be 100% at home as an episode of the TV series.
I 100% agree with you. I'm right there with you. I think you're absolutely right in your ratings there. The story, I think, is absolutely what you'd come to expect from anything Deep Space Nine. And I think the only thing that is a little bit disappointing here is just the art. It doesn't seem to support the story in the way that I would have personally wanted. But I absolutely enjoyed this. And I think, it comes to Star Trek storytelling, I want more stories like this. This is great, and so, and I know we have the book that's going to be coming up that's taking place in the 6th season of Deep Space Nine, the new book that's been coming out this year. That shows how you could still tell really moving stories inside the series of a show. And like you mentioned earlier, this fits so well with the surrounding stories of Deep Space Nine. So very impressed. Highly recommend Too Long a Sacrifice. It is absolutely worth your time. So I would say pick it up, digitally or in trade paperback. It's out like that now. So this is totally worth it.
Yeah. And you may love the art style. It's very subjective.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely.
And, my background is originally I'm a designer, so I understand the creative process very well. So they had the reasons for going with this style, and it might work well for you. Just for us, it was not quite what we would want to see.
Yeah.
Well, Matthew, that was really fun. And as always, I enjoy talking about these stories with you, because one thing that's become clear over the years is that we help each other find different things in stories. I'm reading through, I'm thinking about the points I might want to discuss, but once we start talking, all kinds of other things come up. In particular, when you mentioned how not being able to get the quantum torpedoes could have actually pushed Sisko towards the events of In the Pale Moonlight. That's something I hadn't thought about while I was reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just so much fun, and part of that has to do with, and we mentioned this as we were talking about our ratings, but I think it bears repeating, is that when you have a good story, you can have these type of in-depth conversations. And the best Star Trek stories, and the best stories in general, lead you to be able to have very deep, in-depth conversations. But also, if you're going to tell a story like this one connects so well with the surrounding material that it's supposed to be supporting. You know, they've absolutely done their homework. You know, they've absolutely done what they need to make sure the story fits in continuity. So, well done. You know, absolutely well done to Scott Tipton here with his storytelling. And so I would, love to see more stories like this in the comics. So I'm really excited to see what we'll have next. But Chris, if people wanted to maybe catch up with you and see what you've got going on these days, where can they find you?
Well, the best place to find me is on Twitter. That's my preferred platform, and that's where I'm most active. My username on there is C. Bryan Jones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y. You can also find me in the Babel Conference. My username is social media, C. Bryan Jones everywhere. So if you want to catch up with me on Instagram or places like that, you can find me there. Here on the network, of course, we have an Orb coming up, and we're going to be doing some more episodes of The Orb, where Matthew and I discuss Deep Space Nine. Larry Nemechek and I will have a new Ready Room coming up soon as we can work out the schedule to record that. And also shows like Interphase, The Edge, I'm going to have those going again. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I'll be doing a Patrons Roundtable tomorrow, and we'll be doing one every other week moving forward to get our patrons more involved. And while we're talking about that, Matthew, let's just go ahead and share with everyone. If you want to help us keep the shows going, that's really very, very important these days. We're struggling a little bit as we retool things and come through the pandemic, which is impacting everyone. But if you go to patreon.com/TrekFM, patreon.com/TrekFM, you can find out how to support us there. And one of those perks is the Patrons Roundtable. And what that is just get on mic with me and fellow listeners, and we'll pick a topic and we'll just talk about Star Trek. It's very casual, but it's in the style of our podcasts. And then we put that out there for everyone to listen to. And of course, we have other perks as well, and some new things that I'll be rolling out soon. So that's Patreon if you'd like to support us there. And but yeah, if you want to chat with me as I watch Star Trek and talk about other things, Twitter is the best place for that. And Matthew, when you're not trying to figure out how to install cameras all around your house so you can be sure no one's shooting darts when you're not looking, where can people find you?
Well, of course, here on the network, you can find me doing the 602 Club, which is our whole other side of the network as we're talking about all of the fandoms we love, which is so exciting. And, of course, coming out very, very, very soon, before you know it, we're going to have Snyder Cuts, which is a short-run podcast where John Mills and I are talking about the directorial works of Zack Snyder as we're looking towards his Justice League that is coming out here in March, which is very exciting. So we hope you'll enjoy that. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network doing a couple of shows. One's called Owl Post with Drea Kaufman. We're talking through the Harry Potter series one chapter at a time. Honestly, Chris, we're almost done with that podcast. We only have...
I know, it's amazing.
I know. It's been like
it's such a long story. So
yeah.
How many years?
I think almost 4 years now. So
okay.
It's been a lot of fun, and we're super excited to bring it to a close. And then, of course, John Mills and I are also doing a show over there called Aggressive Negotiations. It's a Star Wars podcast, and we get together and talk about Star Wars each and every week. So I hope you'll check that out. And on social media, you can find me under the name MattRushing02. Chris, we do want to say, though, before we go, a huge thank you to our associate producers through Patreon who make sure that Literary Treks and the network keep coming to you each and every week. And so thank you so much, Craig Rozier, as well as Casey Pettitt, for your support of the network. We really appreciate that. It means a lot to Chris and I that you've continued for so many years. And again,
absolutely.
that's one of the perks that you can get by joining us through Patreon. So again, go over there to patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of the team.
And also, Matthew, I think I'm losing track of what we've told people here at the closing, but I think we haven't told people yet that if you want to share your thoughts on Too Long a Sacrifice, there are several ways you can do that. One is on Facebook in the Babel Conference, which is our listeners group. You can talk to us there. Join if you're not yet a member. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come up. If not, just type the Babel Conference. It is a closed group, so if you're not yet a member, there are 3 questions, actually 2 questions, plus agreeing to the terms of the group, and you need to do all 3 of those things so that I can let you in. But that is a great place to have a discussion. And of course, there's Twitter. TrekFM is our username there. And also, you can just send us an email. Go to trek.fm/contact and use the form there to contact us, and then that'll come to Matthew and me. So there are many ways you can share your thoughts on the story, and of course, we'd love to hear what you think about Too Long a Sacrifice. All right, Matthew. Well, thankfully, Cisco rebuilt Lavin's restaurant, so I think I'm going to head over there. And even though she's not there anymore, I'm really curious, what the new chef's cooking up.
Well, Chris, be careful. You never know when you might find a poisonous dart in your sandwich. So, but thank you so much.
Matthew, they're not Hot Pockets, so don't worry.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.